Ukrainian forces have broken through Russian defenses in the south of the country while expanding their rapid offensive in the east. They're seizing back more territory in areas annexed by Russia and threatening supply lines for Putin's troops. Officials there installed by Moscow have acknowledged Ukraine's advances in the Kherson region, one of 4 that Russia illegally annexed last week. Ukrainian troops are said to have gained territory as much as 30 kilometers away from where the front stood just days ago.
From the regions of Kharkiv in the north to Kherson in the south, the Ukrainian flag is being raised in villages across the country's east once again, as Kyiv's counter-offensive continues to push forward.
Today, the offensive movement of our army and all our defenders continued. There are new liberated settlements in several regions. Fierce fighting continues in many areas of the front.
But beyond the victory, the cost of war emerges. Here in Liman, recaptured by Ukraine at the weekend, bodies of Russian fighters line the streets. Ukrainian soldiers must also collect the bodies of their own. We fight for our land, for our children, so that people can live better, but all this comes at a very high price. Residents like 85-year-old Valentina struggle with what little they have. The Russians may have been forced out, but life here remains grueling.
I'm already fed up with everything. We wish for peace, tranquility, and for our children and families to be alive and healthy.
In towns like Liman, things are far from normal. But there are moments to pause and reflect on what the success means for their future.
Well, for more, let's bring in Justin Crump. He's an intelligence and security expert and CEO of the intelligence consultancy Sibylline. He joins us tonight from the UK. Mr. Crump, welcome to the day. Ukraine has long been working on the Kherson front. Why do you think they managed to break through now?
Joe, it's the offensive there by Ukraine. I think when it started in September, we characterized it as slow, steady, and likely to be successful. And we've certainly talked about it on this program before. There were some assumptions a few weeks ago, I think, when the offensive started in Kharkiv, that the push in Kherson was a feint, just designed to draw off the Russians. We always saw it as a more substantial threat to the Russians than that. And it's just been a different type of operation, though. A lot of the time has been about preparing the ground. The Russians have that problem in Kherson that they're on the wrong side of the Dnipro River. And that's made their supply chains very vulnerable. They've been able to build up some supplies on that bank of the river. Ukraine destroyed those a few nights ago. They targeted where those supplies are being built up, and they hit those. And that seems to have been the key act that opened up this stage of the offensive. So then what they've actually then done is go through the Russian front line. They found weak points in the Russian line. They've ground down the Russian troops, but never rotated. They don't get breaks. They don't reconstitute their formations. They just leave people in place in strongholds, so villages and wood blocks and things. And eventually, of course, the Russians were just ground down to the point that the Ukrainians could punch through their lines. And once they'd gone through those lines, it made it untenable for the Russians to carry on holding the northern section of that front. Hence, they've fallen back as far as they have in the last 2 days.
And how is Russia likely to respond? What are they even capable of at this point?
You know, that second part of the question is quite important, I think, because what are their capabilities? I mean, what was on the front lines was spread very thin. It's very worn down. They had quite a lot of older equipment in that area, which was odd because it was the area that was meant to have been the most reinforced. But certainly some of the older tanks they took out of storage were active in that area, which I think surprised some observers. They believed they were going to be held more in reserve. So I think it shows how spread thin the Russians were and how much they were relying on this very static warfare, defending villages and using artillery to hold the line. Of course, eventually when you get worn down enough, you can't do that anymore when you have ammunition and logistics shortages. So really at this point, I mean, they are pulling back because they don't have a lot of other choices. They'll be trying to consolidate another defensive line. They'll be trying to get supplies up, and they'll be trying to take advantage of the fact it's a shorter front line to be able to have a higher troop density on that line. But they're in a pretty precarious situation. I think both their and at the far eastern end of the line as well at the moment. So for the Russians, it really is just trying to hold on with everything they've got while they mobilize and try and bring more to the fight.
Let's talk about that troop density and more people being brought to the fight. The Russian government says it has so far called up 200,000 reservists. Can these troops realistically be deployed to Ukraine in a way that would make a difference?
What's made the Ukrainian forces effective, that they've used these two offensives, was the fact they took time to build up the forces, to train them, and altogether make them better than the sum of their parts. They used donated equipment. They use the training they're getting in the UK and other nations to create effective forces that could work together very, very well, coordinated well, well led, and they're able to achieve much more than their numbers dictate. Russia's the other way around. They've got lots of people. They are poorly trained at best. They're extremely badly motivated, as we've seen. They're suffering from corruption affecting equipment supplies, food supplies. They can't maintain the people they've got at the moment in the field. And really, their system just isn't working for them. It has so many structural problems that these guys are going to be a lot less effective than their numbers dictate. That said, obviously 200,000 more people on the ground, that's the size of force that Russia deployed at the start of the conflict. It is going to make life more difficult for the Ukrainians, of course, eventually over time. And that's why it's so important for them that they're gathering ground now. They're hitting the Russians while they're weak and before reinforcements have come in an effective manner. Although I don't think the Russians will ever take the time to build up their forces the way they should. They're in too much of a panic to get troops to the front line.
So how long do you think Ukraine can keep up this momentum that they seem to be having?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously, they're very motivated by national defense. So, I mean, morale is kept high in that. They've got higher morale, they're winning. They've got continued support from Western nations and the US. They've been able to hold on to that now since February, and that supply is constantly improving. They're making good use of what they're getting, and effectively, although they're taking losses, of course, in combat, I think the Ukrainian armed forces are actually getting stronger every day, and you see that even in the air, where their air force is more active than it was. It's sort of become increasingly active through the conflict, and of course, Russia would like to have seen it go the other way. So, they've been able to do that. So as long as those conditions remain the same, then they can stay in the fight. I think through the winter into next year, and they've been fighting since 2014. So for them, as long as they have that support, they'll stay in the fight. If that support breaks, and that is Putin's objective at the moment, then Ukraine obviously is going to be left in a more precarious situation.
Yeah. As a possible game changer, Vladimir Putin has been threatening the use of nuclear weapons. And we've seen reports of a train operated by Russian military's nuclear division supposedly headed to Ukraine. How big do you consider the threat of nuclear weapons being used on the battlefield at this point?
I mean, it's a realistic threat, but I think it's one we shouldn't over-exaggerate. I mean, obviously, there's a huge amount of concern about it. To take the train story, for example, that got blown rapidly out of proportion in the last 24 hours or so. Ditto the Russian submarines at sea, Belgorod, their latest submarine at sea. All of that together, I think, got over-exaggerated because people are, of course, very, very concerned about nuclear warfare, as I think we would probably, any sensible person would be, right? So, and that's part of what Putin's trying to achieve, though, I think, by making more noise about nuclear capabilities. It is a realistic prospect for Russia to use them, but not one I think that we should be so immediately scared of that it forces us to accept their lines. I think the signaling is one of desperation at this point.
What advantage would the use of those weapons have for Russia, though? Or would the losses outweigh the gains, really?
I think the loss of face, credibility, it's a real gamble. It's their end state thing to use, is a weapon like this. We call them tactical weapons to be used on the battlefield, but the reality is any nuclear weapon is strategic because of its effect. And so using it somewhere within Ukraine, we'd anticipate probably not a city, because that's a very big stretch. But if they use them on the front line somewhere against a military target, it really does escalate this to the highest levels where effectively it could either be suicide for Russia, or maybe it's their last gamble at victory, that they scare us so much by showing their resolve to use weapons that we crumble, we stop supporting Ukraine, we make peace at any cost. But that is giving in to aggression, of course. And I think it's a dangerous moment for us to look like we would accept that. So that's the big play that's happening in the background here. So keep monitoring it. I'm not losing sleep over it yet. I think there's still a lot of noise about it, and not enough to be desperately concerned about at this stage, because it is the last thing Russia can or will do or really wants to do. But they'll certainly continue to make noise about it.
Justin Crump, military analyst and CEO of Sibylline, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And I'd like to take a closer look now at the nuclear threat with Elena Sokova. She's the executive director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation in the Austrian capital. Welcome back, Ms. Sokova. How close are we to a nuclear escalation of this conflict?
I would probably agree with our previous speaker that we're still far away from the escalation to the nuclear level at the moment. But I would also agree that we should not take it lightly and be prepared and take it serious. It's not zero, and I don't think it's something that we should be considering that coming very soon. So today's kind of discussions and heightened alert about these trains exactly is creating a situation where we could probably misjudge or misinterpret certain moves. But I think that in reality, what Russia has been channeling and Kremlin has been saying, Putin lately, is all about the threat of nuclear retaliation if the US or NATO gets involved directly in the military operations in Ukraine. And we've heard that luckily we have President Biden in the US, who has been very cautious and very clear about that the US would not want to get engaged in the direct military confrontation with Russia.
What the U.S. hasn't been too clear about is about what its response would be to the use of nuclear weapons by Russia, and that is something that Ukraine has vociferously been complaining about. I'd like to play you something the former head of the CIA, David Petraeus, said today about the potential U.S. response, and then get your opinion on it. Here it is.
That said, again, there's a number of responses. The one that I pointed out as a possibility, and it's only a possibility, a hypothetical, would be that this would be where the U.S. and presumably other countries, whether it would be NATO or collective, it's hard to say, could take action within Ukraine, perhaps, in a way that would actually make Russia's situation even worse. In other words, to take out with conventional forces many of the Russian capabilities that still exist in Ukraine and perhaps even on the Black Sea.
Ms. Sokova, it's necessary, of course, to point out that Mr. Petraeus is not a representative of the U.S. government anymore. But how do you feel about this kind of rhetoric being used, not for the first time, by him?
Well, I would agree. First of all, I'm glad he's not in the U.S. government and the U.S. military anymore. I think it's a dangerous rhetoric. This is exactly the scenario that General Petraeus is suggesting that would lead to the escalation. If the U.S. attacks with the conventional forces, Russian fleet, as he suggests, and other major forces in Ukraine and possibly even on the Russian territory, this is a direct way to get Russia's response. And if not an immediate nuclear response, but a possibility of it escalating to a nuclear response. This is something that is actually Putin is channeling with his signals, is that not to have that direct engagement. And it is one of the scenarios in the Russian nuclear doctrine where it prescribes if there is a large-scale conventional attack which threatens the Russian state survival, then the nuclear response would be imminent. And we don't want to gamble with that. So in this case, I think that this is not something that should be discussed or proposed. Obviously, there would be heads and individuals who propose it, but I think it's reckless and irresponsible. at this
The
stage.
German foreign minister says Russia's threat of nuclear weapons use should be taken seriously, but that the international community shouldn't be daunted. That's quite the tightrope act there, isn't it? In your opinion, how is the West so far handling the situation and this threat on the table?
As I said earlier, first of all, I think that I would agree very much with the approach that the U.S. administration, current administration, took in its signaling to Russia, first taking this threat seriously, but at the same time signaling its resolve not to get involved and response to it, and using other means. From what we've heard, that there are discussions, there are conversations with the Russian leadership and signaling that this would be irresponsible. But also, if you think about it, if Russia were to use even the smallest yield nuclear weapons for whatever purposes in Ukraine or even outside of Ukraine, that would change quite a lot for Russia. First of all, even those who have been, if not supportive, but at least neutral or not getting involved, India, China, the development world, it would change overnight the attitude towards Russia and the war in Ukraine. And it would really make Russia a pariah. So I think that there are still many of these constraints that we still have, and that would Russia also would consider seriously and Putin before resorting to the use of nuclear weapons.
I want to zoom out a bit. Excuse me, Ms. Sokova. I want to zoom out a bit because the U.S. isn't just worried about Russia. It's a bigger strategic headache, really, is China. Should we be concerned that the signals Washington is sending to Moscow are also meant for consumption in Beijing?
Oh, I'm sure they are meant for China as well. Because Russia, well, the U.S. has to nowadays to deal with two, both with Russia and with China. And I think that is really put a lot of strain on the ability to handle both these two adversaries. But I would say China is watching very closely both the Russia's move and the U.S. response to both the threats and the actions on the ground related to the war in Ukraine.
Elena Sokova of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Always a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you for having me.